In this video, we're going to talk about how to read data from an external file. Let's get on with it. Understanding how to get data from an external file into your Python program is a really important skill. If you look on the left there under Files, you can see that I've got the main.py file. That's my Python file where I'll be writing my code. And then I've got 4 text files. And we're going to be looking at how we can open each of those to extract the data that's inside them. We're going to start with the simplest one, which is string.txt. It just contains a single 4-letter word. So let's head over to main.py and get stuck in. So in order to open a file in Python, we use the open function. Inside the open function, you need to give it the file name of the file that you want to open. So in this case, it's string.txt. Also inside that open function, if I put a comma, we can type in the mode that we want to use to open this file. So we could put read mode, for example, or write mode, or append mode. But actually, if all you're planning to do is read from the file, that is the default mode. So in fact, you can just miss that bit out altogether. So simply open and in quotes string.txt, that will open the file in read mode. But there's no good just calling the open function. That's going to give us a file object. We need to do something with that. So let's store it in a variable so that we can carry on working with it. So file equals open string.txt. So that string.txt file is now stored in this variable. So that means that I could do something with that variable. So for example, I could do file.read. That is going to extract the contents of the file and give me a string. But again, I have to do something with that extracted string. So let's create another variable. I'm going to call it data string. So now I'm storing the string that we read from the file in that variable. And of course, we could then go ahead and print it. So let's try printing data string. And you'll see that it prints John. So with just those 3 lines of code, we've been able to open, read, and then print the contents of string.txt. Now let's have a look at the comma list.txt file. So this time, we've got John, Emma, David, Sally. Now this is clearly a list of data. I want to be able to extract this and have it stored as a list, not just a single string. So let's look at how we can do that. I'm going to start by using exactly the same technique as before. Create a variable called file. In that variable, I'm going to store list.txt. So that's going to open the file and store it. Remember, we can then read that file and store the string. So let's use that same variable again. Data string equals file.read. Don't forget the brackets. Let's go ahead and print data string at this stage, just so we can see that it's worked and we know we've got the contents of the file. So it's printed John, Emma, David, Sally. But don't forget, that's not a list yet. What we've got there is a string of the characters J-O-H-N, E, M-M-A, etc. Imagine a quote at the start of John and a quote at the end of Sally. It's one long string. So let's delete that print statement and let's look at how we can chop that string up to create a list. So we can do that by taking the data string variable, which contains a string at this stage, and using the .split method. And inside the brackets of the split method, I can put the character that I want it to use to split up the string. So wherever it finds a comma within the string, it's going to use that to mean next item in the list. I need to do something with the list that it's going to create. So let's go ahead and create a variable called data list and store it in there. So data list now contains an actual Python list. Let's go ahead and print that. And there you go. We can now clearly see the square bracket at the start and the end, and we can see that we've got 4 comma-separated string values. Each of those words has got its own quotes. This is now a list. That means that we can do stuff like this. I could say print data list 0. And because it's an actual list, data list 0 means the first item in the list. Let's change that to -1. That now means last item in the list. I have a whole video on lists and indices, so you can go and check that out if you want to. So in that last example, we were looking at a string that contained a comma-separated list. In the next example, we've got the same list, but instead of being comma-separated, this time each word is actually separated by a new line character. Now we can't actually see those in here, but they are there. That character that goes from the N to the start of the E, right there, that isn't a space, that is the new line character. Let's use the same technique that we've learnt about. So create the file variable, store the file that we want, which this time is going to be linelist.txt. Our next job is going to be to read that, and that gives us a string. So I'm going to have a variable called datastring equals file.read. So we've extracted the string from the file. Now we need to actually understand what that string looks like. So whereas before we had something that looked like this, a string with commas in it, this time, instead of commas, we've actually got these new line characters which look like this. But if I was to go ahead and actually print that string with those new line characters in it, you can see that in the output, those new line characters appear as new lines. Well, I've shown you that because you need to understand that these new line characters are actually there. They do exist in the string that we've just extracted from the file. Now, in order to split that string up using those new line characters, we're not going to use .split, although we could. So, for example, we could say data string .split, and then in here I could put \n as the character. And that would work, but actually there is a better way to do it. There's a built-in method for splitting by new lines, and it's called splitlines. So datastring.splitlines will look at that string, look at where those new line characters are, and split the string up into a list. We have to do something with that list. Let's store it in data list, just like we did before. Let's go ahead and print data list. And there you go. So now you know how to extract a comma separated list and also a new line separated list from an external file. And now on to the last example, which is a bit more complicated. If we have a look at the contents of this file, we can see that we've got 4 different lists, and we need to actually have these 4 lists stored within one big list. So we will actually end up with a list of lists, or what's called a 2-dimensional list. So let's have a look at how this works. We can start by using the same technique that we're used to. File equals open, and I want to be opening up 2dlist.txt. I still need to read the contents of that file and store it. So let's make a variable called datastring equals file.read. Let's go ahead and print datastring just so you can see what we've extracted from the file. Now don't be fooled at this point. Although it looks like we've now got 4 lists appearing on the screen, you have to imagine a quote at the start of John and a quote at the end of 95, and there are also some new line characters within there. This is one long string that we've got, and it's our job to do some clever stuff to chop this up and create our 2D list. So we can start by using the same technique that we just used. So let's create a variable called data list, and what I'm going to do is take the data string variable and use splitlines to slice it up. So let's go ahead and print data list. So have a look at the output. You can see that we're making progress. We've now got a set of square brackets, so we know that we're working with a list. But if you look at the number of quotes, you can see that this is currently a list containing 4 strings. We now need to go through each of the individual strings and chop those up into lists so that we end up with a list that contains 4 lists. So in order to do this, we're going to be looping through this list, and we're going to be looking at each of these strings individually. And for each of those strings, what we'll be doing is splitting it up into a list and then appending that to another list. So the next step is going to be to create the 2D list. But for now, we're just going to store an empty list in there. But as we loop through our data list, we're going to be adding the lists that we create to that data 2D list. So now I'm going to create a for loop. I'm going to say for item in data list. So item, remember, refers to each of the strings in this list in turn. First item, second item, third item, and fourth item. And for each of those items, what I need to do is split it, .split, using the comma, just like we did before. That's going to give me a list. But I need to do something with that list. And what I actually need to do is append it to data 2D list. So it's actually going to look like this. Data 2D list dot append, which means add to it. Remember, it's empty at the moment. And what I'm going to be adding is the list that I just got by splitting that string by commas. Once that for loop has completed, let's go ahead and print data 2D list. And now look carefully at the number of square brackets and the quotes. We can now see that we've got one main list. There's a set of square brackets wrapped around the whole thing. Within those, we have got 4 separate lists. And within each of those, we have got 4 strings. So this is now a 2-dimensional list. It is a list of lists. So in order to get to the point where we have a functioning 2D list stored in a variable, it actually took us 6 lines of code if we remove the print from the end. 6 lines of code to get to that point. Now we can actually shorten this program to make it a bit more efficient. So let's have a look at how we can do that. The first thing we can do is look at removing some variables. So here, where I've stored file.read in data string, I could shorten this by taking file.read from there and putting it directly in here. We no longer need the data string variable at all. So now we get a list straight away by saying data list equals file.read.splitlines. Read the file, split it by new line character, and store the list in there. So we've now got one less line of code. The next thing we could do to shorten this is a bit more advanced. It involves using something called list comprehension, which is a method in Python for building lists. So I'm going to delete all of the for loop. I'm going to expand this panel here, just so we've got a bit more room, because the code that I type in here is going to be fairly long. Hopefully you can follow along with this. So to build a 2D list using what's currently stored in data list, I need to do this. I need to say item.split by comma character for every item in data list. And I'll prove to you that that works. If I now say print data 2D list, we can see the output is exactly the same. So I've now managed to achieve the same thing using half the number of lines of code that we had originally. And we could improve this even more by removing one more variable. So here, where I'm storing file.read.splitlines in data list, and then using data list here, I could take all of that from there and simply put it directly in here. Now that is fairly complex. So our finished code looks like this. To build our 2D list, we need to split every item by comma character for all the items that we get by doing file.read.splitlines. We could even shorten this again by removing the file variable. So I could take this code here where we're actually opening the file, and I could put that directly in here. So now we've effectively used one line of code to create our 2D list. Let's go ahead and print data 2D list again, just to confirm that it works. And there we go. Now obviously condensing this all into one single line of code is a lot more complex. Now if you don't understand what I've done here using list comprehension, it's probably a better idea for you to use the longer 6-line version. That way you're at least able to explain the code that you've used. There is another way that you could access the data in these files, and that's using the CSV module. So if I was to import the CSV module, I could then do what we've been doing before. Let's go ahead and open 2D list. And this time I'm going to extract the data from that file using the CSV module, specifically the reader function of the CSV module, and I'm going to pass in the file. So let me just expand this and print data. Now you might be thinking, where's the data? I was expecting to see the lists like we saw before. If you are going to work with the CSV module, you just need to understand how it works. So although you can't print the data, you can still loop through it. So for example, I could say for row in data, print row. So working with the CSV module clearly has its advantages. That code is a lot easier to understand. You just need to be aware of how you work with the data once you've imported it. And there you go. Now you know how to read different types of data from an external file using Python.